solutions, workable solutions, to how nature can be better managed. And there are two glaring gaps in governance, because nature is natural assets don't actually have any natural owners, because they don't have created assets, man-made assets. The process of creation kind of defines who owns them. But man-made, but natural assets don't have these natural owners. Because of that, they're subject to plunder. So without good governance, they get plundered. And plunder takes two forms. So part of what the book is trying to give a precise economic meaning to this emotive concept of plunder. One form of plunder, which everybody understands, is when natural assets which should belong to the many are expropriated by the few. My goodness, we've seen that again and again. The rape of natural assets by greedy interests. But the other form of plunder, a little bit more subtle, it's where things which should belong equally to the future are expropriated by the present. Because our rights over natural assets are much more limited than our rights over other things, as the current generation. We, the current generation, did not make natural assets. They're only there because previous generations have left them to us. We don't have the right to burn them up and consume them. So, at the moment, there's a battleground over nature between whether the people who have the moral high ground are the environmentalists, but their agenda is usually to preserve nature. Now, my core interest is not coming as an environmentalist, but as an economist focused on how can we lift people out of poverty, how can people lift themselves out of poverty. And natural assets are enormously important, potentially, in lifting poor people out of poverty. So, preservation of nature, I don't think is quite the right objective. I think environmentalists are absolutely right to see nature as special, but wrong to see our obligations to the future as basically being curators of nature, there to preserve it at all costs. So what are our obligations to nature? See, I think nature's got moralized before it's got properly analysed. And if we see it from a prism of development, of how people can escape poverty, then I think the right insight is actually coming from economics, which is that natural assets are assets. They're valuable assets. And what we've got to pass on to the future is the value, but not necessarily the particular assets themselves. If Nigeria can take the oil out of the ground, convert that oil into something that's more productive, schools, factories and ports, and hand those assets on to the future, then that, I think, is an ethical use of nature. The thought experiment that we should test to see whether something's ethical is imagine ourselves as representatives of those future people, teleport ourselves into the future and say, are the actions of the present all right by us? Now, if people plunder natural assets, either the few steal from the many, or the present uses those natural assets for its own consumption, then that's not all right by the future. But if the present uses those natural assets to produce more productive assets and hand them to the future, that's responsible behavior. So that's my attempt to, as it were, reinvent the ethics of nature as something that's not, where we're not curators of the artifacts of nature themselves, we're custodians of the value. Now that insight, I think, works across the two major governance problems, which is why a range of natural assets are being mismanaged. And one of those governance problems is in the vaudevillian, where very often governments are not behaving responsibly. We get one or both forms of plunder at the moment. Natural assets that should belong to everybody in the society are being stolen by the few, whether it's foreign resource extraction companies or domestic elites. And on top of that, where resources are used, they're burnt up for consumption rather than invested within the country. So that's a problem in the vaudevillian, and a major chunk of the book is addressing that problem. It's saying, what is the decision chain that has to go right in order for natural assets to be actually discovered, taxed, so captured by the society instead of by narrow interests, used for assets rather than consumption, and invested productively in the economy. We go through that decision chain. And then we say, well, that decision chain is a weakest link problem. There's a lot of links in that chain, and if any one of them breaks, you've got a broken chain. You can't, the society can't lift itself from poverty to prosperity. The sheer scale of the money that's going to come from the exploitation of natural assets in the countries of the vaudevillian is huge. I have one little nugget in the book which I'll share with you. I'll test it out on you. If we take the average square mile of the rich countries, the OECD, underneath that square mile are $300,000 worth of natural subsoil assets. And now we'll move from the rich countries to Africa, and we'll take the average square mile of Africa. And is the figure, what is the figure for that square mile of Africa? You're going to tell me. It could be less, and it could be more, and you're going to vote on it now. Who thinks it's less? And who thinks it's more? And this is why you're all going to remember it, because you're all very wrong. And the true figure is about $60,000. Now, why you all put your hands up for more, in one sense you're all right, which is that surely already the big story for Africa is resource extraction. But actually, far fewer of Africa's natural resources have been discovered than in the OECD. The figures I gave you, of course, were for known subsoil assets. I'd have liked to give you the figure for unknown subsoil assets, but I couldn't find them. And so that huge discrepancy is because there's just been a lot less search. Now, over the next decade or two, that search is going to happen. World commodity prices are high. All these things are going to get discovered. And so the big story, there'll be a tidal wave of money from resource extraction. By hook or by crook, those resources will be found.